Keep it simple. Just try to...
All right, let me get a confident hand to explain this to me without buzzwords, without jargon, without any of that business bullshit. No synergy, none of that. Yes.
So in your model, after you've created your formulas and the process that your inputs and outputs are going to go through, you're assuming that those are 100% correct, so you're just throwing a black box over that, so you're not even going to look at it during the process.
Okay, but why?
Because it doesn't matter if it's 100% correct, that's your assumption.
What's the point? Why would we do this in the first place? What's the intention of looking at it as a black box? It's okay. Here, build on that, Amber. Keep going.
We have information that doesn't really affect the number that we're looking for. So like let's say we're just looking at the profit, we put a black box up with things that don't affect that number necessarily.
Almost. We're almost there. What are we missing? Someone give me their explanation.
For distraction. You don't get distracted with all of your hands.
Partly. So if I put all that together in one, that's a full answer. But really strive to give me that full thing if you could. So the idea, again, behind the black box is that you build this model, it's awesome, it's good. And ultimately, we're trying to understand some calculation or set of calculations as clearly as possible. Remember what we call those? We call them the objective function or the objective function. We're trying to understand those as clearly as possible. So what that means is we want to understand how all these inputs ultimately flow through this complicated set of equations. We couldn't possibly understand every nuance to that. So instead, we simplify our life. And this whole input-output or black box approach is that we can simply look at some output as a result of inputs going through a system and how variability in those inputs ultimately play through into variabilities of our outputs. Or if you like, error or wrongness from those play into error or wrongness in that end calculation. What were you going to say?
I was going to say you don't want people focusing on the process, just want them focusing on the results.
Yeah, assuming the process is right, then yeah, we just want to focus on someone in the earlier class used the analogy of baking a cake. And as long as you know the process of baking a cake and you know how to test if it tastes good or not, that output, it's all about the ingredients. Which of the ingredients are most important and in what quantity. That's the idea.
Who made that announcement?
I can't remember off the top of my head. I would have did. No, ask him. Somebody had it. It was good. Real good. All right. So that's that black box approach. And so in this model, the black box is pretty easy to identify. Right? It's basically all this stuff. And in the last class, I literally put a black box in it. So there's our black box. Up top are all of our inputs. Down below are all our final calculations. And in particular, we're interested in total MPV. And then one last question, how do you identify your inputs versus your outputs on a spreadsheet model?
The color.
Someone give me a hand. Yes, that's good. Okay, but there's nothing blue up here. Okay, what do I make blue? Well, which ones are the inputs then? What are my inputs? Or how do I know what's an input versus an output? Maybe this question is like.
Inputs change.
Yeah.
And all the others are fixed.
So the inputs are the hard-coded numbers. Every single hard-coded number, right? Versus your outputs have to be a calculation, right? They have to be a calculation. Is that obvious?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Cool. All right, so we have our objective function identified. We know where our inputs are. I'll even make them blue. These are all the inputs or variables if you like. This one is not actually, but we'll leave that right there. All right. So ultimately, this whole Monte Carlo process is about understanding and quantifying variability or wrongness. If I have my objective function identified, by the way, this is me walking through the model breakdown process, which is your assignment. If I want to get started on understanding variability and where it comes from, what's my first job? What's the first thing I need to do? Ultimately I want to quantify variability or error in NPV, right? Well, how do I get started?
Unless you have to check the model of their variability.
Who's talking? Sorry.
Right here.
Oh, okay, yes.
Don't you have to pick a model with variability?
What do you mean by that?
Like if you know a number's going to vary by, in a certain range or a certain distribution model, like what's the variability prediction look like?
So you're skipping ahead a little bit, so I'll come back to you when we talk assumptions. But if we didn't even have any assumptions, and we had no deep insight about any of these numbers and what their true value should be, how do I know where to get started? How do I know what to focus on? Yeah.
Choose minimum and maximum inputs.
I don't understand what you mean by that.
So your hard-coded numbers or inputs, you choose a range to evaluate how much your output varies compared to that range.
Okay, so there's one idea we explored is this idea of the reasonable range, right? So he said the minimum and maximum. By that he meant like what's the absolute highest value any one input could take? What's the absolute lowest value any one input could take? 2 sessions ago we explored that with the data table. Remember we built that data table over its reasonable range. And then with Crystal Ball, we learned how to use the tornado chart, right? And so this is how we identified our candidate model drivers. We don't know if there are model drivers, but this gets us started on our candidate model drivers. Okay. Does anyone remember how the tornado chart works? Remember that wiggling thing that I was talking about? So the tornado chart works. Generally speaking, our approach to sensitivity analysis is this. Wiggle each one of your inputs and see how much of a resulting wiggle you get in your output or your objective function. The inputs that lead to the most dramatic wiggle in your objective function are our most important inputs. Those are the ones that we would like to call our model drivers. Okay? So let's start with the tornado analysis. And to do that, first you have to identify a forecast. So I'm going to forecast NPV. Sorry, I'm doing that way too slow, way too fast. So I click on the total NPV, Crystal Ball, define forecast. And then it'll try to guess the name and then units, but these are just for labeling. Okay.
You do that again, sorry.
Crystal Ball forecast, right here. Define forecast. And so it should turn bright blue, and that says that Crystal Ball recognizes that as the calculation to watch as we do stuff in the program. Yeah? All right. So now let's open up the tornado chart. So go to Crystal Ball, Tools. You might have to click on More Tools, and then Tornado Analysis.
What did you put for units?
Nothing. That's just for labeling purposes. So I typically leave it blank. All right. So our target forecast, since we already identified a forecast, it should populate here. There would be a list of them, but we only have one. So there's only one to click on. So that's good. So that's the thing that's going to be wiggled, that's going to be watched as we wiggle up and down the input variables. Dick, don't talk over me. You did that too much. Last class, the class before that, the one before that. Don't even say yes. All right. So a good starting place is to simply add all of the inputs. We can do that with this button right here, add precedence. And what it's doing is it's quite literally just tracing through all the formulas and throwing in a list of all of the inputs that ultimately affect that one final calculation. So if I wanted to do that by hand in Excel, I do it like this. I click on that objective function, say formulas trace precedence. So that's the formula that drives that. I can do it again here. That's the formula that drives that. I can keep going and keep going. And eventually, you're going to end up with tracing precedent all the way until you hit an input where there is no precedent. It gives me an error. There are no precedents for this cell. Okay, so that's all it's doing. That's all your tornado chart is doing. It's tracing back through every single one until it dead ends at a big list of inputs. So this big list of inputs are all of the inputs that we're going to wiggle up and down and see how they affect total NPV. Okay? And then in options, we said if we have no better information, if we have no insight about what any of those inputs were, let's just wiggle them up and down by 10%. It's a super simple way to get started. All it shows us is mechanically how the math is kind of flowing through our model. And what we're going to find is that some of these numbers will wiggle 10%, and it will have an almost imperceptible effect on total NPV. Other numbers will wiggle 10%, and it'll have a pretty dramatic impact on total NPV. Right? And so let's hit run and watch it do that. I'm going to let it show the top 20 variables. And existing cell values. So you do deviation by percentage, existing cell values. Okay. Before I hit run, why 10%? Just it's a nice starting spot. It's reasonable that you have that any estimate has at least 10% error, right? So it's a good place to start. Could you have done 20 or 5? Yeah. As long as they're all wiggled by the same amount, then it's like a nice mode of comparison. Yes.
Is there any possibility to expand just a little bit?
Oh yeah. Not this one. I can expand the model behind it though.
No worries.
All right. So let's hit run on that. So again, options, deviations by percentage, using existing cell values, and I'm going to hit run.
You have to do.
Go ahead. What are you saying?
Well, I noticed the first time you did it, you also clicked existing workbook. This time you didn't do it.
Oh, I meant
So you
to.
just dropped it into a new one.
Yeah, I just put it in a different word. I usually put it in the same one. All right. Yes.
What was the reason you unclicked the spider chart?
The spider chart shows you something very similar without a whole lot of added insight. We didn't talk about the spider chart last time. It shows you nonlinear response between the variable and your variable. It's not a terribly useful tool in business examples because usually your models have a pretty linear response. All right, so again, what is this doing? This is saying go to revenue growth rate. It has a base value of 65%. We said increase 65% by 10%. That's 72%. And plot that into the model. At which point your NPV goes from 1 million, which is this 1 million, and increases up to 1.5 million. Put it back, now decrease it 10%, so you get 59%, at which point your total NPV decreases to 689,000. And then put it back. And then do the same thing with the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So let me just do that quite literally. So this 65%, I'm gonna do it over here. 65% times 1.1, so that's 10% increase, is 71.5. We saw 72 just because of rounding on that other sheet. So if I plug in a 71.5, watch this 1 million. It increases to 1.5 million. So that's that 1-ish million increasing to this 1.5 million. And then if we go the other way, instead of times 1.1, 0.9, that's that 58.5, which rounded up to 59. So if I type in a 58.5, that 1 million goes down to 689,000, which is this spot. So on this axis, this spot is 689,000. Fair? So that's what it's doing quite literally. It's just, and if you have a slower machine and you hit go on the tornado chart, you can actually see it popping in these numbers and calculate. So it did it for every single one, and then it stacked it in order of the widest effect to the skinniest effect. It's the tornado shape that always results. Yes?
That was my question. How it sets that precedent.
Yeah, so it'll calculate the width of that bar, and the biggest ones will be at the top. All right, so now, yes?
Like it's not, oh no, why are the colors, and this may not be irrelevant, but why are the colors switched
Yeah, that's a good
on either
question.
side,
That's a
like
good
going
question.
down the graph?
If you zoomed out, you'd see the legend. It says blue is upside, orange is downside. But that's poor labeling on Crystal Ball's part. What it really means is blue means you increase the input number, and orange means you decrease the input number. So when you increase revenue growth rate, that increases total NPV. When you decrease revenue growth rate, that decreases total NPV, right? So this one's a cost one. This is R&D costs as a percent of revenue. When you increase R&D costs, that increases costs, so it has a downward effect on total NPV. When you decrease, did I do that right? Yeah, downside is orange. Okay. When you decrease costs, it has an upward pressure on your NPV, right? So that's why you see the flip.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, so now turn to your neighbor and explain to them what we learned from this.
Okay, so he took the 58%, right, and put it in here, right? Is that what he did? I believe that's what he did.
He didn't put the 50%. He took the revenue growth.
Right. Well, what I was saying is, because of this, okay, go ahead, finish. Sorry.
And then the same thing, right? So when he increased it by 10%.
Plus or minus 10%. Yes, I got you.
Over here, as soon as you change this variable,
Change this one from 58 to, it was 71.5. That changed the variable down here. And then when he changed this back, yep, got it. So then he changed it to 58.5. And it changed it back to this, which should be, and then
the
this
best way
right
to
here.
do it is doing the calculation here for you.
Correct. Okay, I was wondering, how did he correlate? How did he make the change? So, bless you.
Yeah, so up here, he did the original one, which was 60,000. Which was what was the original number?
65.
So 65, so we did 55, right? And then here he did.
It was 1.1. See that? So I did the same thing.
Can't believe I got that shot.
I did. I said
Do you have a forward-looking camera?
Yeah, no, it's,
He's recording himself. He's recording himself doing this.
what's on Zoom? So I'm just doing, I'm recording the screen. So they're not just recording, so they're not recording. So I just did everything. Yeah, come on, get in the picture. Yeah, that's all right.
All right. So there you have the formula, right? Equals 65
Right. Well, this is 0.9 is
minus 10%.
All right. So let me get another volunteer to explain to our CEOs what they're looking at. You show him this chart and he says, what? Yeah.
It's a sensitivity analysis based on the impact of your different circumstances going on in your production process.
Okay, keep going.
Kind of like a higher low. Average kind of wins, especially based on what would have a higher, and it kind of starts from the top of what's the highest impact and the lowest impact. For example,
so if you have a company, you have one employee, the employee takes a raw material, transforms it, sells it. If what's more important, your employee, your labor going up or down 10%, or your raw material costs going up or down. And this is telling us the one at the top, any deviation in the top metric is way more important than
yeah. Is that fair? So we're wiggling all of these inputs 10%, but just as that's an arbitrary decision. It's like we don't know any better, so that's a starting point. Yeah, it's like assuming we could reasonably be 10% wrong. So let's imagine we were 10% wrong on everything. If we were 10% wrong on everything, this shows us which ones will create the most variability, the most wrongness in our answer, right? So we'll focus on the ones that create the most wrongness in our answer. That's the idea. But this 10% thing, like you're alluding to, isn't a terribly insightful approach, right? This just gets us started because we don't have a better way, if we don't have a better way. So this is why I always said this helps us identify our candidate model drivers. So on the walkthrough, and part of it, I asked you to identify candidate model drivers. So what I would do is I would look at a tornado chart like this, and I'd grab the top some number of stuff, right? So let's go through this process. So I'm going to grab revenue growth rate and mark it on my spreadsheet. So I'm just going to put a little X by that one. Next, we have R&D as a percentage of revenues. So I'll put an X by that one. Beta, market risk premium, revenues, and it's talking about this guy right here. I'm just going to put an X above it.
Quick question too. What would be the difference between that and then the numbers that you have on the other page, and then just put them in order of precedence, so it's higher down to the lowest number? Do they have the same impact numerically as this?
What do you mean the numbers on the other page?
Oh, if you switch back to the data, that data sheet, like that top one revenue is like 50%, and you just organize that to where it's from the high to the low and get kind of a similar assumption on the impacts and all those things, or is that?
If you just sorted these,
I can't see it very well. That's fine.
Wouldn't it mess with the calculations in each one of those cells if you sorted them?
No,
it wouldn't change.
It wouldn't mess with it. But the order of these things doesn't matter. And one of these numbers being bigger or smaller also doesn't necessarily matter, because it depends on how that number flows through all these calculations. Right? So we're just trying to quantify how error in any one of these inputs is ultimately magnified by our black box to turn into NP. Okay. So let me keep going here, and I think that question will become a little bit more clear. So let me just finish marking these. So riskless rate, I'm going to mark. M10, which is over here. I'm going to mark that one. Tax rate, M11. And cost of sales. Yeah, just to refer back to the real model about which of these inputs seem to drive the most variability. So now we're only taking into account that arbitrary 10% wiggle, before we move on, it makes sense to walk through these inputs and ask ourselves if if we do want to consider those in our inspection of variability, and two, if we want to add anything else to that list. Okay, so let's walk through and you'll get a sense of what I mean. So revenue growth rate, super duper important. We got to leave it. Cost of sales as a percent of revenue, also reasonably very important. It's a huge cost driver, as is R&D as a percentage of revenue. Tax rate, if we're trying to understand how variability here ultimately affects our wrongness on total NPV, I don't actually want to do tax rate. Why? Because if we have a tech startup and we're trying to understand the business, it's a fair assumption that our tax rate is going to be around 34, whatever we end up with, right? If startups don't really get to do much tax shielding, and everybody else is doing the same business is exposed to the exact same tax laws. So I'm not learning anything, right? So this is just a fair assumption for me to keep building. It's not really giving me any insight. Similarly, these three items right here, all these three are just used to calculate our cost of equity. Now, if you ask the finance person about this idea of cost of equity and trying to value a project, their response to you would be one of two things. Either your cost of equity is something that is just handed to you from your finance group because it's something that is managed centrally. So if I'm doing a project, I want to use the exact same discount rate as somebody else so we can compare apples to apples. So arguably, these are also things you don't want to include in your sensitivity. So more reasonably, you just want everybody to be at the same cost of equity. And by the way, when I say stuff like that, and you might think like, huh? That's only confusing or unknown to you because this isn't your model in your industry. But if you can imagine me doing a model that's from your work group and your industry, you would have some intuition about certain ones of these things, right? You might say like, oh, that figure right there, that's a negotiated contract. We have that price for 10 years. It's never going to change, right? So let's not include that because it doesn't even make sense for it to increase and decrease. Or something like that, right? These two over here, I don't have much intuition about. I'm just going to leave them in there. What about this one? This first year revenues. Should we include that in our sensitivity? Is there uncertainty in there that I want to try to quantify? Why no? Because they're actuals, yeah. So it is an input. It's a hard-coded input, right? There's no calculation there, but it's just a historical figure. So we wouldn't want to include that because there is no uncertainty associated with the historical. Someone just added it up, and there it is, right? Okay. So you might want to take off some stuff from that list of candidate model drivers. You also may want to add some stuff. So I don't know, just for the sake of conversation, I'm going to say that I'm worried about these two things as well. So I want to also very carefully consider these two inputs. Okay? So what am I ultimately trying to do in this step? I'm trying to figure out which of these things I should put assumptions on top of. Which of these things deserve me to go back and do all that research associated with trying to understand what they could be, what their reasonable ranges are, right? So I wouldn't want to do it to every input, which is why I like to get started with that tornado chart, because that helps me hone in on what probably matters, right? So I get that list of what probably matters. I take off the stuff that I know doesn't matter, and then I add other stuff that didn't show up for that list, right? And then I'm left with this set of stuff. So this guy, these guys, and these guys, right? So that's a good handful of inputs. Now we go through the process of researching those inputs to try to get a really clear understanding of what their value would be or should be, ultimately trying to assign a probability distribution and do that assumption thing. Remember when we did that thing where we said crystal ball, define assumption, and then we put some probability on top of it? So we talked about this in the last class. Traditionally, the way most analysis happens is people build a base case model and they say, here are a bunch of inputs, I'll throw in my best estimates, I build my big model, and then finally I get this final number of 1.5 or 1 million. Right? And what most industries do and what most people do is they say, well, let's just take this base case model. I'm going to create a copy of it, and I'll call my copy the upside. So in this upside model, I'll create a particularly attractive state of the world. So on the higher range of revenue growth rate might be somewhere around 70.
Copy and paste.
Or the better range. The better range of cost of sales might be something cheaper, something closer to like 8%. And same with R&D, maybe something closer to 30%. And so I get an idea of what my upside NPV is, right? So I say something like 2.2 million, 2.2 million, and that's my upside. That's my base. And then I do the exact same thing and I get some downside. Right? So this is how most of the world does analysis. This isn't terribly useful because now instead of one potentially wrong answer, we have 3 potentially wrong answers, right? And not a whole lot of connection between them. So ultimately what we're trying to drive to in this Monte Carlo simulation is to connect these ideas. And if you think back to last session, we ultimately ran that simulation, had that big forecast graph of what NPV should be or what our objective function should be. So instead of doing this approach and having these like upside and downside models, we want to incorporate that idea right into our inputs. So instead of thinking of inputs as one point value that's wrong or right, let's think of it as some distribution, okay? So as to say, and I'm just going to make up values for my assumptions. So as to say, I know that my best guess is that revenue growth rate is 65%. But after I went through the process of researching that idea, that might mean looking at historical values, that might mean looking at comparables, that might be calling an expert internally, or getting in contact with an expert externally through a network like GLG, which is basically just a giant consulting firm that specializes in connecting you with super niche specializations. So like if you wanted to build a power plant in Saudi Arabia using crude oil, inevitably there's someone in the world that they'll do all the legwork and find that and connect you to that. So if you're willing to pay enough money, you can find almost any information in the business world that you want. So you do this, you go through this research, and then you develop some conviction that you expect revenue growth to be somewhere around here, less so or less likely somewhere in the tails. And we go through and we do that for each one of these, right? So this step in practice tends to take a lot of time, like weeks or months, right? A lot of research. So I'm just going to make up a bunch of numbers just so that we have something to look at. And when we were talking about this, there was a question, how do you pick the right distribution when you don't have a clear idea on what that input value is going to be? And my recommendation is if you have no better idea, stick with triangular distribution. Why? I could prove this to you, but it takes a while. It turns out that the actual shape of the distribution has very little impact on error as compared to getting the threshold right. Okay? And triangular distributions work really well because they agree well with how people are used to thinking about this stuff. As in, what's my expected value, what's an absolutely lower end of the reasonable range, and what's the upper end of the reasonable range. Okay? So it's pretty easy to get here.
Is that actually one of the tangible deliverables that you would give a client if you're doing this for somebody?
Yeah, exactly. Because there would be a lot of thought put into those things. And yeah, that's usually something people are really interested in. Yes. Sorry?
Right time.
2:15. All right, let's break. How much you want? How much are you?
30.
Let's come back at 30.
Let me see if I did this, man. I don't even know if I recorded it. But check this out. It says stop recording.
More better. Yeah, I'm just checking. No, my
I'm doing it now too. I'm recording it now. So.
You're still recording, right? Pause recording.
Oh, sorry. Damn.
So just to recap, the whole point up to now is this whole process of identifying where the variability comes from and then incorporating it in our analysis. So we started by identifying an objective function. The first step was tornado chart deviation by percentage, to which we added and removed some items based on business judgment. Once we have that list, we go through the process of drawing on the assumptions. And that's this idea of, instead of thinking of any number as like a right or wrong, and then an upper or lower kind of reasonable range, think about that entire thing as just a draw from some probability distribution. And if we can do this with all of our model drivers, then ultimately, instead of thinking about the final calculation of MPV as a base upside and downside case, we can think of that itself as some crazy probability distribution. Right? So in the same way that we want to think of revenue growth rate as like a random draw from this probability distribution, we want to think of that like true NPV as a random draw from the forecast distribution. So this is where we're driving to still. All right, so we have that list of candidate model drivers. We threw on the assumption, and then it makes sense to go back one more time and validate how much of an impact those assumptions have on the probability, or excuse me, on the NPV. So then it's good practice to go back and do one more tornado chart. Just redo it, but this time, instead of all of your inputs, just add the assumptions. And so now we're doing the exact same thing. We're wiggling our assumptions up and down, but instead of this 10% that doesn't really make sense, right? This was this like very, very arbitrary up 10% and then down 10%. Which didn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual reasonable range of this assumption. So we go through all that research, and maybe we develop some kind of an idea of the true value as this distribution. So now let's do this exact same tornado chart thing again, but instead of going the up, down 10%, let's take it with respect to all that research that went into this probability distribution. So now let's just wiggle it to the extremes of the probability distribution. Why? Because to do that takes into account not only the model mechanics, like we did with the percentage, but it also takes into account the reasonable range of those inputs. Okay, so it's possible that you have some input that's kind of magnified by your model mechanics and seems to have a really big impact when doing it by percentage. But when you look at it with respect to its assumption, maybe not so much. Right? So we're going to do it one more time and see what comes out, and then we'll get a clearer picture of what matters. Oops. There's the wrong thing. Sorry. Do that again. Tools. Tornado analysis. Input variables. I said remove all and then add assumptions. And then now percentiles. So instead of this up and down 10 percentage, it's the 10th and the 90th percentile, which are kind of the extremes of the probability distribution. And I like to do with respect to the median values, meaning the middle of the probability.
To 10 to 90? What did you change the test range from 10 to?
I changed from deviations to percentiles. So it went from plus or minus 10% to from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile. Yes.
Change.
I'm sorry, I was testing the.
This is still a type of sensitivity analysis with tornado charts, but
It didn't change.
instead of by percentage, we go by percentile. That's what I call it. And so when we did it by percentage, just because we didn't know better, we said those were our candidate model drivers. So now when we do it by percentiles with all this research that went into these distributions, those we'll just call our straight up model drivers. That's the idea. So this should say percentiles. This should say use median values. This should say 10 to 90. And then we should get. Okay. So do it one more time. And if you compare this to what you got last time, you'll notice that it's slightly different. So now revenue growth rate seems to have an even more dramatic impact as compared to your other areas. Because not only does it have a huge amount of variability in its reasonable range, but that huge amount of variability is then further magnified by all the calculations. Okay? And vice versa for this thing over here. This D10 seemed like it had some kind of a meaningful impact before when we did it by percentage. When we incorporated its percentiles, its reasonable range, we found that it's pretty useless. Sorry, not useless. It doesn't have a significant impact to variability. So if we wanted to even remove these two assumptions, it wouldn't substantially change our.
Question.
Yes.
Can you flip back to the spreadsheet to show what D10 and do that?
Oh, okay.
So remember I added those in, I was like, I think that those are probably touchy. I'm just gonna add these in based on my business judgment. Turned out my business judgment with that. By the way, if I forgot to tell you this earlier, if you want to remove a crystal ball markup, like an assumption or a forecast, you can't use the regular delete, you want to use the crystal ball there. Same with copying and pasting assumptions, you want to use the crystal ball.
Can you show again how to add an assumption?
Yep, just click on the cell you want to add it to, crystal ball, define assumption. Okay, so now we get to a pretty clear understanding of where variability, or if you like, error, is coming from. And we can move on to the final step, which is actually running the simulation to get this distribution thing. And so the way the simulation runs is actually quite simple. All it does, I'm going to tell you the process, and for one trial, and it's going to do that because I've type in 100,000 trials, it's going to do that 100,000 times over. So 100,000 times over, it'll do this process. It'll dig into each one of those green assumptions, those distributions, take a random pick, plop it into the spreadsheet, calculate through, and then remember the number in blue. Okay? That's trial one. Trial two, again, another independent random pick from each one of those, plop it, and then remember the number. It'll do that 100,000 times, and then you have a list of 100,000 different NPV scenarios. If you put that in one big histogram, that exactly is that. So now instead of looking at your total NPV as some number that might be wrong and some like maybe upper number that might be wrong and some lower number that might be wrong, we have it all just in one big connected idea. Right? So what is NPV? Well, it's going to be as if it's a random draw from this distribution. Right? So we can ask more intelligent questions like, what is the likelihood of, say I have a company with a hurdle rate of 400,000 in NPV, meaning I wouldn't ever commit to a project. I would never allocate funds to fund a project that didn't earn me at least 400,000 in NPV. A lot of companies work like that, or with like a hurdle rate for ROI or something like that. So I could type in 400,000 on the lower axis, or slide this bar over to 400,000. And so the area under the blue stuff is 96%. So I would interpret that as assuming that my assumptions and my model are directionally correct, I expect with 96% certainty, or I expect there to be a 96% probability that this project is worth between 400 or greater than 400,000. Okay. So the nice thing about this is, as opposed to this, you can ask really specific questions that actually can drive managerial decision making in a way that this never could. With this, you'd have to take some leap of faith or some real rough estimate. With this, you can very specifically ask that question. Okay? And then, so just to recap, all that tornado analysis stuff, that was all trying to identify where the uncertainty or variability was coming from. And then this is now quantifying and incorporating it all into our idea of NPV. Okay? So I like to teach this stuff on a financial model just because dollars and cents are so straightforward, but you can do the exact same thing on a process model. If you want to calculate process times, like the distribution of completion time of something, which is what we're going to wrap up with at the end of session 5. You could do this on an inventory model if you're trying to predict stockouts and the likelihood of stockouts, any number of things. Okay? But the important thing is you understand this process of first structuring your model so it's easy to look at, identifying your objective function. Once you have your objective function identified, then you can go through that iterative process of tornado analysis to figure out where your error or uncertainty is coming from. And then finally, you add those assumptions and you can incorporate that into your idea of what the objective formula calculates.
I hope you didn't already say this, but why 100,000 trials as opposed to 1,000 trials?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good question. And the easiest way to answer that question is to start with a tiny amount of trials. So if there's 100 trials, we're doing that thing of random picks and then calculating through them. We're only doing it 100 times. And when I hit go, so there's 100 trials, right? And so what this is, you know, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is a frequency chart. It's just a histogram. But if you only pick 100 trials, there's still a lot of like random volatility represented. Remember that conversation we had about coin flips last time? So we want to get to that true coin flip, like true likelihood of flipping heads. And so the only way to do that is to wash out that random volatility by doing it a lot of times. And that way we're not going to end up flipping heads, and thinking that there's a high likelihood of flipping heads. So when we increase that, then it continues to run trials and trials and trials until we get some kind of an idea, that's 10,000, some kind of an idea of a smooth distribution of what to expect.
Percentage is always the same.
Cool. So that's what I want you to do on your model breakdown assignment. A question back there?
Yeah, if we're trying to do get this all to show up on the spreadsheet, And if it's not showing up, you just want to add ins and make sure that bringing in.
Yeah, so a couple of things. You can launch Crystal Ball from your start menu and it'll automatically launch Excel, right? If it doesn't, or if you launched Excel before you open Crystal Ball, you go File, Options, Add-ins, depending on your version. It's a COM add-in. So just make sure that thing's checked. If you have 2017, then there's a developer tab up here. And same thing, click add-ins, COM add-ins. Right. All right, so it's 10 to 3. Let's take the next 40 minutes. That's 3:30. Let's say tentatively the next 40 minutes, just to work on your model breakdown assignment. It's basically what I just did up here, but this time you do it on your own and make sure you're comfortable with each of the steps. Again, the point of the assignment is less about the numbers because I'm asking you to just make up assumptions when you get there. What's more important to me is the memo and that it explains what's going on with clarity. Okay, so make sure before you leave here you can do that with clarity. Sound good? All right, get to it and I'll wander around and answer questions.